This week, I was feeling very nostalgic. I was reflecting on just my childhood, and it's been a long time since I've been a child. I was reflecting on not just my childhood, but the homes that I used to live in. And I was trying to remember the rooms, what the kitchen smelled like, the layouts of the homes. And they were really helpful for me to kind of reflect on what kind of upbringing I had, what kind of experience growing up in the home was like. I remember growing up as a child and feeling like my parents were the best parents in the world, everything is perfect. And then somehow a switch went off, and I could see all my parents' flaws. I mean, that was teenage years. I mean, I could point out all the different places where my parents were just not up to snuff. Somewhere along the way, though, and it's strange, I'm 43, but all of a sudden this wave of thanks is kind of hitting me. Because even though they were so imperfect, and if you, like most of us, we can write an encyclopedia on how way our parents were imperfect. I was reflecting on just how much who I am and the good of what I've received in Christ came from my house, came from my experience at home. Not because my parents were so perfect, but I can say, yes, there's always hypocrisy everywhere you see it, but I can say with a great deal of honesty that who my dad was, who my mother was at home, wasn't that far off from who they were at church. What I experienced of the church, the truths of Christ, the lived out truths of Christ, the love of Christ, at home wasn't that far off in many ways from what I saw in the scriptures, what I encountered in God. And I found that so much of my kind of deep core of who I am, not just because of my parents and what they taught me and so on and so forth, what they modeled for me, but I experience God in my home. And I can't tell you, just as a 43-year-old man, just how thankful I am now that in my journey, that experience of God in the home was so valuable. I don't know if some of them who grew up with me felt the same way. I had a lot of friends growing up who, their parents were at the church and so on and so forth, and I sometimes just assumed that, our families were the same. When I was a little younger, I still am sometimes, not very wise. I used to kind of just blurt things out. And I remember when I was probably like 10 or 11 years old, and I was hanging out with my friend, and it was actually at a church talent show. And we were just talking, goofing off, and then there was another boy, a little younger than me actually, who showed up and did this incredible memory verse thing. I mean, kind of like the verse. I mean, he was incredible. I was like, wow. And part of me kind of felt like, wow, if the kid could do this, we're the adults. My father was always leading choir, but there wasn't a lot of adult representation. So as this little punk kid, I turned over to my friend's father, who was this very regal, tall man. And he always comported himself with a lot of grace. I said to him, kind of not very respectfully, how come you're not doing anything? And he looked at me like, and then he just kind of turned red, but didn't say anything to me. That next week, my friend didn't show up to church. And this is a day and age where if you don't show up to church, you had a car accident or somebody died, right? Because you're always at church. And I was really worried about him. I didn't have his phone number, and so I was a young kid. And so I waited. The next week, he showed up, and I asked him, what happened? And he told me the story. And he didn't blame me that much, but he said, you know what you said to my dad? It made him so angry, he came home and beat the living crap out of me and my brother, basically saying, don't you dare ever disrespect somebody older like that boy did. And at first, I felt so bad. I felt the sense of shame. Like, oh my gosh, I got my friend, he just got completely beat up by his dad. It was my mouth, it was my fault. And I was kind of beating myself for a little while. But now I realize the reason why it was such a shock to me is because I never faced that at home. My home was safe. My dad didn't raise his voice at home. The only time he raised his voice was to sing. Whenever he faced stress, I saw him translate that in faith through song. Whenever my mom faced stress, I saw her translate that in prayer. And they weren't perfect. They fought a lot. Okay? They worked together for how many years in a small business, and they were at each other's throats at times. But in the midst of that, I saw a living reality of God's love and His way of conflict resolution, even in the home. I experienced what it means to be hospitable through God in our house. We would have people come over, not only for like events, but people stayed over in our house. Our family, some of them stayed for 6 months. It was so uncomfortable, and I would ask my parents, why are you doing this? It wasn't family alone. It was God in their hearts of what it means to be hospitable. I could see it. I learned what it means to be God-fearing through my parents. That they honored God, and they tried to teach me in their way what it means to respect God and to be God-fearing. So we would sit in a service in Korean, and I didn't understand a thing, and I would just be this rambunctious child, just rah, rah, rah. And out of respect and love, and sometimes out of fear of my dad, I would sit still. And even though at first I didn't understand how valuable that was, but it taught me that there is one who is worthy of attention in the little things. And like I'm saying, I feel like every time I keep thinking about this, I'm so thankful. It wasn't perfect. And I am praying that my children, maybe I'm being selfish, but I'm praying that my children can say the same. That the father they saw preaching and leading at church was the same man at home. That they could see Christ. They could experience God. Even in the flawed nature of my marriage and my parenting, in the midst of that, still they would sense and experience God in the home. And that's my prayer. It's been something that's been really brewing in me lately, especially. Well, as you can tell, this is something that I'm moving our whole sermon series toward. Because I see how important this is and how empty this is, actually, in a lot of different places. How I think in the church even, this has been emptied out. That the emphasis of God in the home has kind of fallen by the wayside. Where sometimes in a response to, there was an overt religiousness in some of our homes, we've actually pulled away. And I think we're in danger of hiding or even excluding God in our home life. And in the midst of this, I feel very convicted in my own heart that even though I'm a pastor, and I told myself, and I told God, I will not be like those religious pastors who were tubing people. I'm really realizing that I need to grow as someone who brings God in my home more intentionally. And so I'm not speaking as one who's like self-righteous saying, I got it all worked out, but I'm praying that even as we go through this sermon series, that we can really reflect on this. And I wrestled with, actually, how do I communicate this? Who is God supposed to be in our home? What is our home supposed to be in the design of God? If somebody asked you, a non-Christian, and said, I'm really interested in the family, what does God have to say about what the home is supposed to be? What is the blueprint for the home? How would you begin to articulate that? Yeah. How would you begin to articulate that? I think a beautiful way that the early church did that was they described the home as a little church, described the home as a domestic church. All the good that you can imagine of being in part of God's household is mapped out in your home household. And it's like a little church, all the good of that. Well, I think as I was describing, that this is getting somehow lost in our day and age. Here's some figures, by the way. In 2002, Southern Baptists, and you can write them off because they're Southern Baptists, because a lot of people do. You can laugh because I'm ordained Southern Baptist at this point. But Southern Baptists did this whole study, and they looked at a lot of evangelical homes. And it's the Family Life Council that did this, and they presented in 2002 that they looked at children who were raised in evangelical homes, and then they followed up with them, seeing if they still have a life in church, still have kind of a vibrant life of faith. And the percent of the children who were raised in evangelical homes who left the church was 88%. And this number has been a little debunked because a lot of them come back, by the way. But there's this huge, strange exodus. You wonder, is this just natural that you grow up in an evangelical home, that you just, a home that says that God is alive and everything is centered around God? How is this possible? And it was kind of like a warning cry for people to pay attention. They cited just the divorce rates and decided kind of talking about how the disruption and destruction of family has really, these are the fruits of, that children who see this, whether it's the hypocrisy in the home or just the stress and the brokenness in the home, that they're not turning to God and they're not coming back to Him in the context of church. Well, another guy actually, I think is Dr. David Kenneman. He wrote a book, and he tried to break it down a little more. He tried to say, okay, this is not a good figure, and what's really going on in this generation? And he's talking about the youth. You've lost me. And he followed through, and he said, well, the numbers aren't that bad. It's a little different. He talks about 3 different groups. Prodigals. He's saying 1 out of 9, 11%. After experiencing life in an evangelical home, Bible-believing, Christ-worshiping home, 11% said, I will have nothing to do with it. I will never come back. That's scary, 11%. 40% are called nomads. They don't know how to express it in church, and they're going from church to church or in church, out of church. There's no sense of home. They can't anchor themselves for whatever reason. And then there are 20% who feel like exiles, that they don't know how to express their faith. So it's a little better figure, but if you add these numbers up, do the math, it's still 71%. There isn't the sense of, you grew up in a home that loved and honored God, and you have a life with God. You can say there's a lot of reasons why our culture is shifting quite a bit and so on and so forth. But could it be, one of the reasons is, God is not being brought to the center of our house in a way where the children and the youth are feeling it. It's been communicated to them that God is real. And it's not being somehow impressed into their lives. You can blame the church, saying, oh, the church is just not doing their job. But let's be honest here. For a lot of these children, many times, they're only in church for 2 hours out of the week. Or if that, because these days, we are missing church. There's not a sense of regularity about that. Maybe 2 hours out of the month. What is going to carry in their hearts and lives this sense of, this is who God is. This is the center of life. If it's not in the home. Yeah. So, this is part of the things that I've been really wrestling with, realizing that if we don't find God, establish God, turn to God, and kind of wrestle with this, it's not just that our children won't know faith, but it actually, I think, dissolves and dilutes what church really is meant to be. A sense of household, a sense of belonging and equipping. If we carry stuff from a home into the church, if we don't have that sense of connectedness where both are places of love and equipping, we're really going to miss out. And so I want to be preaching a whole series on this. It's a longer series than normal. And you got a little soft opening. I didn't tell you that I was preaching on this last week. But you got a soft opening because whether you knew it or not, we're talking about God in the home through our praying mothers. Today we're talking about that title, that little description of what our home life is supposed to be in God's design, a domestic church. Next week I'm going to talk about marriages, but not all the details of like how to have a good marriage, 10 perfect formulas for having a beautiful marriage. Actually, there's all good stuff out there, but I'm going to talk specifically about marital spirituality, how to have a life with God together as a couple. How important that is, and setting the foundation of God in the home. This is very important, not just for married people, but especially for singles as well. What to look forward to, what to plan for. And I try to be really careful about not kind of saying family, 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 as if this is all about family. In other words, husband, wife, and 2 children, 2.4 children. It's not about that. It's about the household of God. It's about who you are in your home setting, because that's who you are. That's what you carry. That's your identity ultimately. And so, please be aware of that. Please, it's not so much. I don't want to disenfranchise people. I really believe that this is not simply just about the nuclear family. But we are going to talk about also on June 2nd the significance of intergenerational worship. That when we're the household of God together, you get to see how the adults worship. You get an idea, and you are in some ways shown as a child what God-fearing looks like. It's modeled before you. These days, church is so specialized that they have no idea how to plan for and look forward to grow into mature faith. Nothing's before them. So we're going to talk a little about that on June 2nd. Father's Day, looking forward. talk about shepherding fathers, and it's going to round up with our graduation Sunday, where we talk about moving forward and seeing our children not only graduating school, but graduating in life. Okay, so that's the sermon series coming up, Faith at Home. But today, I want to look at the Old Testament and the New a little and reflect on what was God's intent. What is the home supposed to be? Is it supposed to be a place where you just chill, relax, because the world is scary and it's tiring, and you can just let all your masks down. You don't have to be this happy person at work or at church, and you can just kind of be yourself? Or is there more? Is there more that God had planned for the home to be? Let's read this to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Now, at this time, there wasn't a temple. There was a tent of meeting. But if you pay closer attention, all this language is about teach your children how to have a life with God, how to follow Him, right? How to be in, almost like coaching them. Talk to them everywhere you go about who God is and how to live with and for Him. This is a description about spiritual formation. It's about centering God in our children's life and the next generation's life. But you notice the places and the ways you do this, it's not emphasizing the synagogues. It's not emphasizing the corporate worship. This is an emphasis of God in the household, right? Impress them upon your children. Who are the priests here? Who are the teachers? It's actually the parents. The responsibility, yes, priests have, but the primary one, which is going to carry the day to see children come to grow to know and love and worship God, is in the setting of the household, on the parents. Okay? Well, isn't that interesting? Look at that verse 9. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. As a way of saying, when you come to your house, as a physical reminder of who you belong to, what your identity is, and what this house purpose is for, make sure you realize even your homes are not separate from a life with God, but they are the center. Write this verse and put it on your household. Yeah. So if you have Jewish friends, you know that they have this thing called a mezuzah. Okay. So this is a Jewish door. This is a Jewish home on the door. And you see that little thing on the doorpost? It's angled a little. I found out that only specific kinds of Jews do this. It's called Ashkenazi Jews. Most of them have them straight up and down because in that setting they're trying to compromise, because rabbis can get really, really anal. They're arguing between whether this should be horizontal to be straight, and they just kind of compromised, right? But that little case, that little mezuzah case, is inside it are these verses that are written out. Okay? Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. And where this is repeated again. Teach your children about these commandments. Talk with them. Put this on your door frame. That's how they did it. But if you imagine, if you walk in, unless you're really tuning it out, this thing is right there as a physical reminder. Some Jews also have stuff that they put on their hands and on their foreheads. We don't do that, okay? But this is a way of saying the home is a place where God is not forgotten, or He's not in the center, but right at the doorstep. Okay, right as you're walking in is a physical reminder that this is a place for spiritual formation. God is to be in your home, at the center of your home. Homes weren't always a place where we did everything apart from our spiritual activity, you know? Homes were always the center of our spiritual activity. Okay? Before they had these nice, beautiful churches, where did worship happen? Where did the Spirit of God move? Where did people find and encounter God? It was in the homes. Okay? So in the New Testament, you see that this language of house church, the church in the house. Priscilla and Aquila, they had a house, they had a church in their house. It was referenced. Nympha and Philemon, they had churches in their house. So you're worshiping, and this is kind of funny, we're going to have communion today, and we have these nice bowls and so on and so forth, but when they had communion, it was right in the middle of dinner. And seamlessly, they went from dinner and loving each other, celebrating, and so on and so forth, having this setting of fellowship, to a sacred place where they're recognizing Jesus died for them. Their very existence, their very identity is because of who Christ is, and he's at the center. It wasn't because they had special plates or they had a special place. Yes, they did have ritual, but it jumped right from the love feast into communion. Worship happened like this in the home. Can you imagine if, that's what they did in the home, because there wasn't any large buildings. It was in richer people's homes, like in kind of the front room area. Imagine if your living room, you just had a revival the night before. You can't just look at the place and be the same. It's the very physical reminders are there to say, this is a sacred place. This is where God moves. Church happened in the home. Okay? In referencing these people, and he's describing how these churches were actually households. Almost a very similar word used to describe the household of God. The same language for Stephanus, for people belonging to the household of Caesar. They were having worship in Caesar's house. The people, the household of Caesar were worshiping. Onesiphorus. These languages of house and household kind of remind us that at the very center of what church is, it's family of God, household of God, in a home setting. John Calvin, he wrote this kind of reflecting on the mention of Stephanus' household, that the church is happening. They're experiencing God and they're worshiping God in the household of Stephanus. He says, what a wonderful thing to put on record, that the name church is applied to a single family. Okay? And yet it is fitting that all the families of believers should be organized in such a way as to be so many little churches. The name church references one family. And he's saying, that's not a strange thing. That's the way it should be. That this church should be a joint gathering of many little churches. Does that change the way you think about your home life? What would you do at home that you wouldn't do at church? I think that should change how we think of church, even. I think one of the reasons why we have a little difficulty is this, and I realize I'm jumping ahead in my sermon, is that we have to reflect on what church is supposed to mean. But I have another slide to show you. Actually, I like this slide, by the way. You see this picture? There's a bride and a groom and an Orthodox priest, and there's these crowns being placed on their heads. Do you recognize them? Okay. They're not royalty. They're just Joe Schmo, Orthodox couple. Why are they putting crowns on their heads? Because in the symbol of this, Christian religion, they are saying the crowns represent, and every couple who gets married in an Orthodox wedding have crowns on them. It represents that they are the rulers. They are the queens and kings who are in their leadership. They're supposed to lead a domestic church. They're told at their wedding, God is making a household of you. But the intent of this household is not so that you can have nice meals and have companionship and enjoy your family and have a place of rest and belonging alone apart from God. That their role is to raise up kings and queens, those who have this sense of sonship, daughtership in God, and they're leaders of a domestic church. Okay. So, I think we should reflect on what church means, because sometimes it's very hard to think home, church. They're two different identities. Because when we think of church, we think of it like, hey, I'm going to church. Sometimes I catch myself saying that. I leave earlier than my girls, and as a bye, I'm saying, bye, I'm going to church now. Bye, Daddy. And they know what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's right here. It's right outside. This is church, right? It's a place. Or sometimes we think, oh, I'm going to church because we have a prayer meeting, or we have a guest speaker coming in, or we have an event. Church is about an event, a place, or an event. And in many ways, it's true. When we gather, we're gathering as a church. But actually, it falls short of the real expression of what church is. Church was never a place. Because if it was, then it'd be your home. It wasn't just an event. It was described where you are a people that have been brought out from the world. That you've been brought out to God. You've been separated from the world now. And that word ecclesia is the word itself. Gathered, called out to God, to belong to Him, to be His and be on mission for Him. Isn't that interesting? If that's the name of church, then church is not a place. It's not an event. It is an identity. It's who I am, who we are. We do church. We live church. We are church. We don't go to church. Yeah. That means if we're at home, we are church. Okay? I don't stop being Korean when I go home. Or American. You know what I mean? Korean American. I don't stop being a man. All right? These are identity markers. Who I am is who I am. At home, at work, at church. And if church means the gathered people of God, then when you gather at home in your home life, that's who your identity is. Before you are a separate family, you are a little church at home. As a single person, maybe you're living by yourself. Guess what? Even where you are, your home setting is a place where you can actually say, God, you are at the center of this place. And the time that I spend here, who I am here, revolves around my true identity. I am a part of your body, gathered people of God. Especially if you're planning to have a family, to practice that. I try to give a little extra a metaphor for this. I'm not going to do too much of the do this, do that, do this. I'll have a few, but we're going to unpack this throughout this whole series. This is more of an introduction. I really feel like we need to get some biblical grounding in this as well as we've put these together, that home is not separate from our lives as the people of God. So here's my way of describing this. I was thinking about a greenhouse. And here in this picture, you see the greenhouse. It's dark, and if you can pay attention, it's actually snow on the ground. But inside, there is life a-busting. There's light, there's warmth, there's all kinds of, there's green exploding that it wouldn't if it was outside. Can you imagine if God's intent for your home is to be like a greenhouse? That out in the world, there's backstabbing, there's ugliness, there is selfishness, there's no reverencing God at all. But in your home, when they cross those boundaries, they should feel the covenant warmth, the love of God. They just feel it. They should just sense it. And they'd be able to know how to practice it and grow and thrive in it. Have you thought about that? That your home and its boundaries should mark, guess what? This is a place where, just like church ought to be, incredible warmth and love because God is moving and reigning in our home. Yeah. And sometimes I've experienced that at times, even in my single life. So when I was a single person, I didn't spend a lot of time at home. I was always either working or at church, but mostly in my car. I was a youth pastor. So I was always picking up kids and dropping home kids. And they would always have problems, and the counseling session would happen in the car. I would pray for them and so on and so forth. And it got really funny. The church, that car felt like my home. And every time somebody would walk into the car, okay, they would say two things. Oh, it smells like coffee. My car still smells like coffee. They would say, oh, this car is all beat up, but I just feel so happy. It's funny. My mom, one time, she actually, can you take me for a ride? I'm like, why? She's like, I'm having a hard time to pray, but I notice every time I'm in your car, I pray really, really well. And I'm like, what is this about my car? It's really funny. My car, you can ask my friends and my parents, nobody could drive it. I would let them try to borrow it, and they try to turn the engine on, and it wouldn't work. But every time I would get in the car, it would work fine for me. And I realized that was like a little portable home. I would be meditating there. God, I would be praying. I would be listening to praise songs. I would be talking to people. I would be sharing God's love. And it became almost like seeped into the very upholstery of the car. And I wonder if our homes were like that. You ever come to a house and you just feel the warmth of God because He's worshipped there and there's love there? That's part of the intent. That's what our church is supposed to be like, by the way. They see it on our faces. It's not after being said. It's expressed in the gut, in the spirit. It should be like a greenhouse where covenant love is so nourishing that life is exploding. Both our church and our little churches, our domestic churches, be places where core values are shaped. Isn't that true? What you really learn about what's important, what you fight for, is found in the home. Isn't that true? Yeah, it's modeled, it's fought for in the home. Where our identity and belonging are realized, you discover who you are, and who you are is nurtured, right? And lastly, I think the home and the church and the home, should be places where your life mission and your training is happening. My dad spent a lot of time training me, teaching me about life, teaching me about how to fix things. And at first I was really bitter, but I'm realizing how valuable that was. But he also trained me. He talked to me about God. I always say that I was always the brainiac. In other words, whenever we had like Bible quiz, even as a young child, even the older kids, I would beat them without. I don't know why I have a penchant for useless information sometimes, but I would grasp all these Bible truths, and I would always win those Bible quizzes. And it wasn't because I spent that much time at church. And I realized, where did I get all that? My dad was talking to me about God, about the Bible. He's training me, he was coaching me, and my mom too. And there was a life, a faith life that was burgeoning because of that. What should be happening at church in these kinds of ways should be happening at home. And so let me give you 3 things as we finish up, as a way of reflecting on how can we begin to merge these and choose intentionally to shape the culture of our homes where God is at the center. Okay? Number 1, I think we have to stop and say, what's going on? What is your default when you go home? Okay? So when you think of home, what do you think? Oh, I can just relax. I can take off my masks. I can be myself. That's great. But shouldn't home also be a place where you're being sheltered and shaped in a spiritual sense? Yeah? Have you done that? Thought about how you shape your time, your activities, your space in the home to reflect that God is at the center. I want you to reimagine what your home would look like, okay, if God was at the center of your home. What kind of practices, what kind of experiences you'd be having in the home. And I think we have to reimagine it. Otherwise, it degrades into something that actually does not reflect God. Second, I think we really need to journey with our partners, because if a wife tries to do it and fights with the husband, it's going to be very hard. If the husband tries to do it and fight with the wife, you have to work together. But the most powerful ally in this is your children, okay? Especially young children. If you tell your children, we're going to do devotions, we're going to pray every night, guess who's going to keep you accountable? You come home when you're tired, like, oh, let's just go to sleep, kids. The children will say, but Dad, you promised. They'll keep you accountable. And when you get them to ally together, say, children, we really want, this home belongs to God. And this is how we're going to start trying to really experience God. We're going to grow in God together. Watch. You'd be surprised how the children would want that. Okay? Lastly, I'm using this title to say, mezuzah your home life. The mezuzah was like this physical expression to remind you that the home is a place where God is at the center. And you can experience Him. You can worship Him. You can grow and instruct Him in Him. Well, I think in my parents' generation, they tried. They had their own versions. I didn't realize this till now. I was reflecting on, what did my parents try to do to say that our home was Christian? That God is the center of our home? And if you ever saw this picture, you'll know what I'm talking about. I can walk into any house, and I see that picture, I know they're Christian. Or at least they go to church. You guys know the story of that picture? 1950, some Chinese guy was looking for God, and he was trying to talk to God, and I don't know where you are you real? And he heard a voice saying, take a picture right now over there. And he just did it out of faith. And he supposedly, it could be a sham, who knows. But he developed the picture, and Jesus was in the snow. Well, I remember this being in every stinking house. I'm like, oh, I know that. We have one in our house, right? And it was their way of saying, who do we belong to? Who's the Lord of this house? They would put it in a prominent place. And when they would look at it, and And I think I was too sophisticated for that. I was like, oh man, not that picture again. It could be a sham, right? Or if you see those kinds of Bible plaques, maybe if you're a different culture, you came from a different setting, but in my culture, they have these plaques, okay, these gaudy wood chunks with gilded, Bible phrases. Okay, that's Proverbs 3, by the way. Anyway, they would have a bunch of them. When I got ordained at a Korean church, I think I got about 10 of them. And I feel so bad. I think I recycled them all. Because I thought to myself, like, oh my gosh, that's so cheesy. That's like, I'm going to show who God is in my life through my speech. I'm going to be like, all incarnational about it. But I realize there's very little in my house that I intentionally both reminds me, but I choose to say, this house belongs to God. Yeah. And I think I lost a lot. Not to say I'm going to go buy that picture and put it up. And don't get some cheap, cross and plaster and say, oh. Think of a way to symbolize, God, you are the ruler of this house. To remind yourself. Do it beautifully. We need artists to do this for us in a beautiful way. Maybe photographers, right? To do this to remind us, hey, this house belongs to God. Yeah. So I think we've lost some, but in both form and in content. In not only the way just you quickly pray before you eat, but structure your home as a way of, God, you're in our house. And we'll talk more about that along the way. I'm going to close with just a poignant passage in the book of Joshua, where Joshua realizes that the people of God have been wandering for 40 years, and yet they are still conflicted. They're caught up in the world. I quiet timed my way through this this year, and as I was going through this, God pointed out, wait a minute, why is Joshua saying to the people who have been following him for 40 years in the desert, throw away the gods the idols and the gods that you have held on to from Abraham's time beyond the river to the gods of Egypt. They've been collecting gods, and they've been cluttering their homes for all this time. They're about ready to go into the new land, and they still have them. They think, I can just be church, we can be God's people, and still have this close to our hearts in our homes. He's saying, get rid of them. He says, I'm going to lead the charge. Okay? Either serve them or serve God. Either have God in your home or not. Okay? Who are you? Establish your identity. And he says, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. As for me and my household, okay, the areas I have influence in, we are going to be the people of God. And that challenge goes out to you today and to us, that we would be a collection of little churches, that what we do here is a culmination, okay, echoing, resonating powerfully with what we do and who we are in our homes. That not only our children, but our guests would be able to say, God is alive. God is at the center of all that we are and do. Would you bow your heads with me as we pray?